In 2018, in the desert town of St. George, Utah, the story began with a single decision that would ripple through every corner of the community. Officer Naomi Carter had been a respected member of the local police force, a woman known for discipline and an unshakable sense of duty. Yet on one quiet evening, she crossed a line no officer was meant to cross. She granted a prisoner his last request, believing she was showing mercy, believing it would end with a small act of humanity quickly forgotten. What followed was far from small. That gesture pulled open a hidden door into a world she had never imagined, a world built on false names, falsified reports, and recordings manipulated so carefully that truth itself sounded like a lie. Behind the walls of justice there existed a factory of deception, where evidence could vanish with a keystroke and voices could be forged with surgical precision. Naomi had not meant to challenge that machine, but by honoring the prisoner's plea, she set herself against powers that thrived in silence. They moved quickly to erase her, to scrub her decision from the record, to bury her under charges that would silence her forever. Still, somewhere in the shadows, one witness remained. He had survived what others did not, carrying fragments of the truth that could dismantle everything built on falsehood. His existence was a secret the system could not allow to surface, the single spark capable of burning down the carefully constructed walls of deception. And although Naomi did not yet know it, the moment she chose compassion over protocol, she had become part of a struggle far larger than herself, one that would test whether justice could ever survive in a place where truth had been rewritten. The viewers were welcomed with an invitation to step into a story that demanded their attention, a story that promised to reveal the cost of choices made in silence. They were reminded that staying until the end would mean uncovering truths buried beneath layers of deception, and they were urged to remain connected, to join a community built around stories that mattered by leaving their mark in comments and ensuring they would never miss the next revelation. Beyond this opening, the focus shifted toward the figure at the center of the unfolding drama, a woman who had once been a symbol of strength in her city. Officer Naomi Carter had served the small desert town of St. George with loyalty and a quiet sense of determination. She was not celebrated for grand gestures, but rather for the steadiness of her presence, for the way she carried herself as though rules and duty were stitched into her very being. Yet now she sat alone on a narrow bench in a holding cell, stripped of her badge, her uniform reduced to an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely against her frame. The air inside the cell was damp and cold, the kind of cold that did not simply brush the skin, but settled deep into the bones, leaving a person feeling smaller than the stone walls around them. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow that deepened the shadows instead of clearing them away. Her hands rested quietly on her knees, the rhythm of her breath steady, though her mind raced with a memory of the night that had changed everything. The first test had already arrived in a form she had never anticipated. She had not fallen to corruption or to greed. Instead, she had answered the plea of a dying man, and in doing so, she had crossed a line that the system refused to forgive. What she thought would pass as a fleeting act of compassion had become a charge of betrayal, and the weight of that accusation pressed on her shoulders heavier than the shackles that bound her wrists. Beyond the steel bars, the hallways stretched in silence, but the silence carried with it a sense of menace, a warning that this was only the beginning. Outside, the desert town that had once been her home prepared for another dawn. But for Naomi Carter, the light of that new day carried no warmth, only the promise of trials she had never expected to face. The courtroom carried an air of suffocating weight as Naomi Carter was brought forward in chains, her movements limited by the clatter of metal that echoed with every step she took. The walls were modest, lined with tired wooden panels, but the atmosphere was sharpened by the presence of reporters scattered like vultures, their pens scratching across paper with the hunger of those who lived on scandal. Naomi stood within the defendant's box, her shoulders squared though her heart trembled. The accusations were laid out in crisp, merciless language, each one striking like a hammer. She had aided in the escape of a convict. She had tampered with official records. She had conspired against the very system she once swore to uphold. Her appointed defender looked young and unsure, his hands trembling as he adjusted his papers, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case. Across from her, the prosecution stood confident, dressed in authority and sharpened by ambition. His words were delivered with cold precision, each syllable shaping her image into that of a traitor, a woman who had turned her back on the badge. Naomi listened, her throat dry, her chest heavy with the rising pressure of fear. Every point he made cut deeper, not because it was true, but because it carried the weight of credibility, the kind that could sway a judge before evidence was even considered. Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred. She thought of the man whose final request she had honored, of the injustice she had seen in his eyes, of the desperate truth he had shared with her. She thought of the system that had silenced him and now sought to silence her in the same way. That flicker of memory hardened her resolve, though her pulse throbbed like a drumbeat of dread. When the gavel struck to pause proceedings, the sound reverberated through her chest. The judge announced that her evidence would not yet be heard, that her claims required verification, and until then she would remain in custody with no hope of bail. The decision landed like a stone in her stomach, heavy and unforgiving. She was led back toward the holding cells, the murmurs of the courtroom trailing behind her like shadows. As she passed through the corridor, a folded scrap of paper brushed against her wrist, slipped so quickly she almost thought it imagined. Later, in the solitude of her cell, she opened it with shaking fingers. The message was scrawled in uneven lines, but the words pierced through her despair. He is alive. Watch for the signs. The morning began with the stale scent of dust drifting through the vents, the air thick enough to coat the tongue. Breakfast never arrived at her cell, and when Naomi asked, the guard shrugged it off as an error, though she knew it was no mistake. Hunger clawed at her stomach, but she forced herself to sit upright, her back against the cold wall, watching the thin strip of light crawl across the floor. In the women's block, the silence broke with the heavy steps of Officer Briggs. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his expression fixed in a flat smile that carried no warmth. His eyes swept across the inmates until they landed on her, and even without words, the warning was clear. The message came later, his voice low enough to be missed by others, his presence towering and oppressive. In that moment, she understood her place was no longer that of an officer, but of a number in a system that thrived on erasing identities. The day dragged her into the yard, where a sledgehammer was pressed into her hands and a line of rocks waited beneath the weight of the desert sun. The heat was merciless, the dry wind cutting into her throat, her palms blistering as the metal handle burned against her skin. Each strike echoed through her arms, and by midday her body ached with exhaustion. Sweat streaked down her back, her vision blurred, and yet she kept moving, unwilling to let the weight of punishment break her completely. When night finally came, she lay on her cot, muscles trembling, her lips cracked from thirst. In the shadows, her cellmate Rain leaned closer, her eyes cautious, her presence both fragile and defiant. Naomi whispered her need, the desperation of a single call, a single confirmation that might link the scattered pieces of truth together. Rain gave a brief nod toward the medical ward, hinting at the nurse who sometimes dared to help, though danger lingered in every corridor and Briggs's watchful gaze followed like a predator's. The next day, Naomi allowed her body to become the disguise. She staggered, let her face drain of color, let her breath grow shallow and uneven until guards dragged her toward the clinic. The smell of antiseptic replaced the dust, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the small room. Nurse Mara checked her pulse, her brow furrowed as she studied Naomi's eyes, as if she could see through the pretense into the deeper wound of betrayal. Mara's whispered words carried recognition, and Naomi seized a chance, naming the hospital and the alias she had seen scrawled on the slip of paper. Time stretched painfully after the nurse left, every second grinding against her nerves, the sterile walls closing in. When Mara finally returned, her face carried both caution and dread. She spoke quietly, reporting the arrival of a man with severe head trauma, admitted under the false name, and quickly transferred under the watch of a private security company with no traceable ties. Relief and fear collided within Naomi's chest, her eyes closing as she absorbed the possibility that he still lived, hidden behind fabricated records. Her moment of fragile hope was shattered when the door swung violently open. Officer Briggs entered, his presence filling the small clinic, his grin sharp and deliberate. He reached for the blinds, dragging them shut until the room was steeped in shadows. His voice cut through the silence, low and cold, declaring that heroes had no place there, only inmates who learned the cost of defiance. Briggs leaned over her, his shadow blotting out the pale light that dripped from the ceiling. His face hovered too close, the stench of coffee and sweat filling the narrow space between them. His words were laced with poison, a reminder that every scrap of paper, every whispered message, every flicker of resistance had already caught his attention. He promised her nothing but darkness, the kind that ended without warning, the kind where a switch was never turned back on. Naomi's pulse raced, her muscles tense, though she refused to flinch. The sudden crash of the door breaking open startled them both. A figure stepped in with measured authority, shoulders squared and eyes sharp with steel. It was Jonathan Hale, her former captain, now a man retired but not weakened. His presence filled the room with something stronger than intimidation, certainty. He held an official order in his hand, the seal of oversight clear, and his voice was firm enough to strip Briggs of his smirk. Ordered to leave, the officer backed away slowly, but not without letting his venom drip one last time. He muttered that her so-called hero would not survive long, a warning meant to bruise deeper than any threat of fists. When Briggs was gone, the room settled into a heavy quiet. Hale took the seat beside her, his frame weary yet grounded in resolve. He spoke of his departure from the department, of the contracts that had eaten away at justice from within, of Sloane's grip that reached deeper than anyone had admitted. He made it clear that Naomi's fall was not an isolated strike, but part of a larger design. His belief, spoken without hesitation, was that Elias was still alive, hidden under layers of deception. Naomi pulled the crumpled note from her clothing and placed it in his hand. The name written there, the clinic, the shadow of Red Rock, all pointed to a trail that could still be followed. She asked for protection for the nurse who had risked herself, for access to the records that might prove the truth. Hale's expression hardened. He promised his remaining connections in forensics and medical examiners would lend their weight, but to strike back, they needed more than whispers. They needed an image undeniable, one that would cut Briggs down before he could strike again. A trap had to be set, one that would leave no room for denial. That night, Nurse Mara slipped quietly into the ward, her hand steady as she fixed a hidden camera inside the grate of the ventilation shaft. Hale moved beyond the prison walls, arranging with internal security for immediate intervention at the right moment. Naomi, exhausted yet clear in her mind, wrote the bait herself. The note carried a time, a place, and the promise of vulnerability. Midnight in the medical block, the words lured the predator closer. When the hour came, the air was thick with silence. The door creaked open and Briggs entered alone, his breath heavy, his eyes glinting with anticipation. He moved toward her slowly, savoring the moment, his hand already reaching. In that instant, boots struck the floor from the corridor, and the room flooded with authority. Two members of internal security stormed in with Hale behind them, his phone raised, the live recording displayed for all to see. Briggs froze, caught between shadow and spotlight, his power stripped away as cuffs clamped around his wrists. Hale's voice cut the air, announcing the arrest with finality. Naomi exhaled for the first time in days, her lungs trembling with release. Yet even in relief, her mind knew the battle was not over. Hale leaned closer, his words sharp, meant only for her. Elias had been moved, and tomorrow the court would decide her fate. Either they tore the mask from Red Rock completely, or she would be buried deeper than before. The courthouse overflowed with people, the aisles crowded with reporters, officers, and townsfolk who had come to witness the trial that had gripped the entire community. Flashbulbs erupted like bursts of lightning, their sharp glare bouncing off the polished wood and the steel cuffs that bound Naomi Carter's wrists. She wore the same orange uniform that had marked her for weeks as a prisoner, yet she held her head high, her jaw set in defiance. The weight of stairs pressed heavily upon her, but she refused to let the chains drag her spirit down. Prosecutor Gavin Milner stood with calculated poise, his smile thin and rehearsed. He painted her as reckless, a woman whose supposed sense of mercy had crossed into criminality. His words were sharp, designed to remind the jury and the public of her disgrace, and he repeated his earlier claim that the defense's so-called evidence was nothing more than digital trickery. He suggested once again that the audio recording she had clung to was worthless, a fabrication unworthy of the court's time. Then Jonathan Hale rose from his seat. The years weighed on his face, but his voice carried the command of the officer he once had been. He announced that the defense had more than just sound. He presented a video capturing Officer Briggs abusing his position, a recording that displayed not only misconduct, but also the intimidation and erasure of evidence that explained how Naomi had been framed. The footage was displayed on the screen before the court, and the low hum of whispers filled the chamber. For the first time since proceedings had begun, the veneer of certainty began to fracture. Hale was not finished. He stated with unwavering resolve that there was another presence in the room, a witness known on paper as Lance Miller, but in truth the man at the heart of Naomi's act of defiance. Elias Rowe. The courtroom doors opened, and the sound of wheels on tile echoed through the silence. Elias was brought in a wheelchair, his body weakened, his skin pale from weeks of captivity, but his eyes burned with clarity that seized the room. Naomi's breath caught in her chest as she saw him alive, the image of his face breaking through the cloud of despair she had carried for so long. Elias spoke with quiet strength. He told the court that he had been moved under false pretenses, hidden away in Sandstone Medical, guarded by Red Rock Secure under a fabricated name. He described how experts had been prepared to discredit Naomi's evidence, how Sloan himself had boasted about rewriting logs and bending records until the truth no longer had shape. The weight of his testimony filled the chamber with unease, every word tightening the grip of exposure around those who had orchestrated the deception. A forensic audio expert from Salt Lake City was then called forward. His report confirmed what Naomi had insisted all along. The audio was genuine, unaltered, free of cuts or manipulations. The previous declaration of forgery was itself a falsification, a manufactured shield designed to protect Sloan and his partners. His findings left no room for doubt, and even the murmurs of the gallery grew louder with outrage. The judge reviewed the evidence slowly, his eyes scanning the documents with deliberate care. The once confident prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his face drained of color as the foundation of his case crumbled beneath him. The defense then pushed further, calling Ian Sloan into the courtroom. He entered with false assurance, still dressed in authority, still wearing the mask of control. For a fleeting moment, it seemed he believed he could weather the storm. That illusion broke when Hale unveiled a second video. The grainy footage showed a Red Rock warehouse at night, the unloading of detainees without paperwork. The shadows of men moved like cargo. At the center of the recording, Sloan's figure appeared, giving orders, his voice clear, his gestures unmistakable. Gasps spread through the room, the kind that carried both shock and a hunger for justice. Sloan's confidence faltered, the sweat at his temple betraying him in ways words never could. The gavel struck hard, echoing like thunder through the chamber. The judge called for a 30-minute recess, his voice heavy with the gravity of the decision that loomed. Naomi closed her eyes as the sound reverberated in her ears. Her heart pounded, torn between the fragile hope of freedom and the suffocating fear of darkness. Everything she had endured, every moment of despair and defiance, now hung suspended in the space between those minutes at 80 precisely 4:05 p.m. The courtroom doors opened, and the judge returned, his face composed yet heavy with the weight of the decision he carried. The atmosphere shifted, every breath drawn tighter, every movement silenced into anticipation. He read the ruling in a voice that resonated through the chamber, declaring that in light of new testimony, authenticated evidence, and indisputable video records, all charges against Naomi Carter were dismissed. He further announced that the files concerning Ian Sloan and Red Rock Secure would be transferred to federal authorities for immediate investigation. The sound of the gavel striking was final, but for Naomi it took several moments before the meaning sank into her bones. She remained motionless, as though the chains at her wrists had fused into her skin, until she felt the pressure ease and the cuffs fall away. The touch of freedom was almost unreal, her wrists raw but unbound, her body trembling as she took her first unshackled step. Her eyes turned toward Elias. He sat waiting, fragile in his wheelchair, yet radiant with stubborn strength that no captivity had extinguished. She moved to him slowly, as though afraid the vision might dissolve if she reached too quickly. When she stood before him, their eyes met, and the silence between them carried the weight of all they had endured. She bent slightly, her lips close to his ear, and he answered with a faint smile that seemed to gather what little strength he had left. For the first time in weeks, her chest loosened, and the air she breathed was no longer thick with despair. Months passed, and summer spread its heat across the streets of St. George. Naomi chose not to return to her old badge. The forest was a place marked by scars she could not bear to reopen. Instead, she poured her efforts into building something new, standing beside Mar and Rain as they established a center for witness support, a refuge for voices that too often went unheard. Hale, though older and removed from uniform, continued to guide from the margins, lending his knowledge to ensure that oversight reached where corruption had once thrived. Briggs was stripped of his authority, awaiting trial behind the same walls where he once held power. Sloan and his closest allies were no longer shadows in control, but prisoners facing justice under the watch of federal courts. On an evening drenched in the amber light of a desert sunset, Naomi and Elias stood at the edge of the barren land, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. The silence of the desert was vast, broken only by the wind that carried the scent of sand and sage. Elias looked out at the fading light with quiet reflection, his question emerging like a thought long carried. Naomi's answer was steady, shaped by everything she had seen, everything she had survived. The truth, she knew, was not guaranteed victory. But without struggle, without resistance, it never stood a chance at all. The viewers were reminded that what they had witnessed was not simply the fall and rise of one woman, but a testament to the fragile thread of hope that could endure even in the darkest corners. They were invited to carry the story forward, to share, to remain present for what was still to come, to hold on to the possibility that justice and hope could live as long as there were those willing to fight for them.